Imagine for a moment, you're on the deck of a pirate ship rocking on the turbulent waters of the Caribbean, surrounded by men who trust you with their lives. The scorching sun burns your skin while the smell of gunpowder and sweat fills the air. But there's something your comrades don't know. You've been skimming part of the treasure that was supposed to be shared equally among everyone. What do you think would happen if they found out? The answer to that question reveals one of the most brutal and fascinating aspects of pirate life that rarely gets told in movies or adventure books. Because, you see, among pirates, there was an unwritten law stricter than any official code. Betrayal within the crew was considered the most unforgivable crime a man could commit. But why was it so serious? To fully understand, we need to dive into the dark waters of pirate hierarchy and discover how these men, already living outside the bounds of civilized society, created their own relentless system of justice. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when piracy reached its peak, pirate ships operated under a surprisingly advanced democratic system for the time. Unlike merchant ships or the Royal Navy, where captains held absolute power, pirates elected their leaders and established codes of conduct everyone had to follow. At the heart of this code was a fundamental principle: loot had to be divided fairly among all crew members. This was not just a matter of fairness, it was a matter of survival. Think about it. These men constantly risked their lives, facing deadly storms, bloody battles, and the constant threat of the gallows. If they couldn't trust each other, if there was no guarantee that everyone would get their fair share of the risk taken, the whole system would collapse. A pirate who stole from his comrades wasn't just committing theft. He was destroying the very foundation on which their society was built. But how exactly did this system of division work? Pirate codes, such as the famous Bartholomew Roberts Code or the laws of Henry Morgan, laid out with mathematical precision how the treasure should be distributed. The captain normally received a larger share, usually twice as much, as an ordinary sailor. The first mate, the quartermaster, and other officers also received increased portions. The crew's musicians, yes, there were musicians aboard, got a full share. Even those injured in combat were entitled to specific compensations. Losing a right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8, a left arm or leg 500 pieces, an eye or finger 100 pieces. Now imagine you discovered someone was manipulating this system, that while you risked your life boarding Spanish galleons loaded with gold, one of your mates was secretly pocketing jewels and coins for himself. How would you feel? And more importantly, what would you do? The discovery of a thief within the crew usually happened dramatically. Maybe someone noticed that the division of the last loot didn't match what had been captured. Or perhaps a pirate was caught red-handed hiding valuables in his personal chest. There are reports of pirates discovered trying to secretly sell part of the treasure at ports without the crew's knowledge. When this happened, the process that followed was both fascinating and terrifying. First, the accused was brought before the entire crew gathered on the main deck. There were no lawyers, no appeals, just the improvised court of the pirates themselves, who served as judge and jury. Evidence was presented publicly. Witnesses spoke. The accused had the right to defend himself, but few managed to satisfactorily explain the presence of undeclared treasure among their belongings. Then came the vote. Every crew member had one vote on the guilt or innocence of the accused, but what if found guilty? That's where the story truly turns dark. The fate of a pirate thief varied, depending on the severity of the crime and the particular mood of the crew, but some punishments recurred with terrifying frequency in historical accounts. The most common, and perhaps cruelest punishment, was marooning. The condemned was abandoned on a deserted island with only a pistol, a single bullet, some gunpowder, and sometimes a bottle of water. The logic behind this was simple. If the man had the courage to steal from his comrades, let him have the courage to survive alone. The pistol served a grim purpose. When hunger and thirst became unbearable, the condemned could choose a quick death. There are islands in the Caribbean still known today by locals as Dead Man's Islands, precisely because they were used for this kind of punishment. Imagine the mental agony of these men, sitting on the hot sand, staring at the endless horizon. knowing their former comrades had sailed away, leaving them to die slowly. But punishment was not always abandonment. Sometimes the crew opted for something more immediate. There are records of traitorous pirates being forced to walk the plank, although this practice was less common than Hollywood would have us believe. More often, the condemned was simply thrown overboard into shark-infested waters or summarily shot in the head right there on the deck. A particularly cruel punishment was keel hauling. The condemned was tied with ropes and dragged underneath the ship from one side to the other. The hulls of ships at the time were covered with barnacles and other sharp marine organisms. Few men survived this torture, and those who did were forever marked, with deep scars telling the story of their betrayal. But maybe you're wondering, was this brutality really necessary? Were there no other ways to deal with thieves? The answer leads us to the heart of pirate psychology and reveals why these punishments were not only accepted, but considered essential. You see, pirates lived in a society where the only law was the one they made themselves. There was no police to call, no courts to appeal to, no prisons to send criminals to. More importantly, they needed a system so terrible that no one dared break the rules. The brutality of the punishments served as a powerful psychological deterrent. Furthermore, there is another factor rarely considered. Pirates were often men who had already been betrayed by civilized society. Former sailors abandoned by cruel captains, runaway slaves, men unjustly condemned. For them, loyalty was not just a virtue, it was the only thing that separated their new life from their past experiences. So a man who broke that loyalty wasn't just committing a crime, he was destroying the only family these men had. Now you might be thinking that not every case ended in death or abandonment, and you would be right. There were gradations of punishment, based on the severity of the crime and specific circumstances. For lesser offenses, say hiding a few silver coins, a pirate might receive public lashes, lose his share of the next loot, or be demoted in rank. Some pirate codes even prescribed fines. The offender would pay a specific amount into the crew's common fund. But here's a fascinating detail few know. Sometimes the crew itself offered the condemned a chance at redemption. In some documented cases, thieving pirates were forced to accept the most dangerous missions in upcoming raids. Essentially, a death sentence with a possibility of pardon if they survived and proved their loyalty. There is the recorded case of a pirate named Tom Peterson, not to be confused with other historical figures, who was caught stealing pearls from the common treasure in 1715. Instead of executing him, his crew offered a choice: be abandoned on an island or lead alone the attack on the next merchant ship they encountered. Peterson chose the suicidal mission and surprisingly not only survived but captured a valuable shipment of spices. He was readmitted to the crew, though he never again held a position of full trust. But not everyone was so lucky, and here we arrive at one of the most intriguing questions on this subject. What led a man to steal from his own crew, knowing the terrible consequences he would face if discovered? The motivations were as varied as the men themselves. Some were simply greedy, men who, even after abandoning civilized society, couldn't shed their most basic instincts for accumulation. Others were desperate. Perhaps they had debts in distant ports, families to support, or plans to eventually leave piracy and needed extra money to start a new life. There were also those driven by distrust. Pirates who suspected their captains or officers were hiding part of the treasure and decided to make up for it by taking an extra share for themselves. Ironically, this distrust was sometimes justified. There are documented cases of pirate captains keeping secret treasures, violating their own codes. And then there were the addicts. Men who developed dependencies on alcohol, opium, or gambling and needed constant money to feed their vices. These were perhaps the most tragic, because their compulsions led to repeated betrayals, even though they knew they would eventually be caught. But here's a twist few would expect. Not all thieves were actually guilty. The pirate justice system, although democratic, was not infallible. Personal rivalries, jealousy, or simple misunderstandings sometimes resulted in false accusations. There is the disturbing account of Marcus Red Sullivan, an experienced gunner who was accused of theft in 1718 after diamonds were found in his chest. Sullivan insisted he had won them in card games with other crew members, but no one admitted to playing with him. He was voted guilty and abandoned on an island near Tortuga. 2 years later, when the crew returned to that area, they found a skeleton on the beach along with a message etched in stone. "I was not guilty," read. It was later discovered that the diamonds had been planted by another pirate who had a personal rivalry with Sullivan and wanted his position on the ship. The real culprit confessed on his deathbed, but it was too late for Sullivan. Cases like this raise deep questions about the nature of pirate justice. On one hand, it was a remarkably democratic system for its time. Every man had a voice and a vote. On the other, it was a system where emotions ran high, where armed and often drunken men made life or death decisions based on evidence that would be considered insufficient in any modern court. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how this system evolved over time. The early 17th century pirates tended to be more brutal in their punishments, perhaps because many were former buccaneers used to wilder methods. By the later days of the golden age of piracy, some codes became more sophisticated, including provisions for more detailed investigations and even improvised lawyers to defend the accused. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, for example, established a system where accusations of theft had to be investigated by a committee of 3 men before being brought to a general vote. This system significantly reduced false accusations, but also made it harder to catch clever thieves. Now you might wonder how many pirates actually tried to steal from their crews. Historical records suggest that despite severe punishments, the crime was more common than one might expect. It's estimated that around 10% of all active pirates between 1650 and 1730 were accused of internal theft at some point in their careers. Of course, not all were found guilty, but the number suggests the temptation was constant. This leads us to another intriguing question. Did the brutal punishments really work as a deterrent? The evidence is mixed. On one hand, many pirates, clearly, thought twice before attempting to steal from their comrades. On the other, the fact that the crime kept happening suggests not everyone was dissuaded by fear of consequences. Perhaps the explanation lies in the particular psychology of men who chose the pirate life. These were, by nature, individuals willing to take extreme risks. Men who abandoned the safety of land life to live a precarious existence at sea, constantly threatened by storms, disease, battles, and execution. For minds like that, perhaps even the threat of abandonment on a deserted island seemed just another acceptable risk. There is also the factor of psychological denial. Many thieving pirates probably believed they would never get caught. Or if they were clever enough, careful enough, who would find out? The same arrogance that led them to attack cannon-protected ships also made them believe they could fool their own mates. But what about those who were caught and punished? What lessons did their stories teach the survivors? Here we find one of the darkest aspects of pirate psychology. Executions and abandonments became part of the crew's folklore, stories told and retold during the long nights at sea. These stories served multiple purposes. First, they kept alive the memory of the punishments, constantly reminding all crew members of the consequences of betrayal. Second, they humanized the condemned, transforming them from mere criminals into tragic figures whose fates served as warnings. And third, these narratives helped process the psychological trauma of having executed or abandoned a comrade. Because, let's be clear about this, no matter how justified these punishments were under the pirate code, they still involved men killing or condemning to death other men with whom they had shared meals, dangers, and camaraderie. The psychological burden of that cannot be underestimated. Some pirates developed elaborate rituals around these executions, perhaps as a way to cope with guilt. The condemned might receive a last special meal, a chance to make a final speech, or even choose the method of their execution. These rituals served to give dignity to the process, and perhaps more importantly, to distinguish these deaths from the summary executions pirates sometimes imposed on captured enemies. But not all stories ended in tragedy. There are rare but documented cases of condemned pirates who managed to escape their fate through extraordinary circumstances. Take the case of Black Pete Morrison, abandoned on a small island in the Bahamas in 1721 after being caught stealing rubies. Morrison managed to signal a passing merchant ship 3 months later and was rescued. But instead of seeking revenge against his former crew, he apparently learned his lesson. Years later, port records show he settled as a respectable merchant in Charleston, using knowledge gained during his pirate years to build a legitimate import business. Cases like Morrison's raise deep philosophical questions about redemption and justice. Did pirate punishments, brutal as they were, sometimes truly cure men of their criminal tendencies, or was Morrison simply a rare exception? Unfortunately, it's impossible to know. Most abandoned pirates were never seen again, their fates lost to history, and those who were summarily executed obviously had no chance at redemption. But the few survival and reform stories suggest that, at least in some cases, the pirate justice system, imperfect as it was, could produce outcomes beyond mere revenge. As the golden age of piracy drew to a close in the 1730s, these stories of betrayal and punishment became part of the pirate mythology that persists to this day. But as with many aspects of pirate history, the reality was more complex and more human than the myths suggest. Pirates who stole from their own crews were not simply greedy villains in adventure stories. They were complex, fallible men who made terrible decisions under extreme circumstances. And the crews who judged and punished them were not bloodthirsty monsters, but improvised societies trying to maintain order in a chaotic life. Perhaps the most important lesson from these stories is about the fundamental nature of trust in human communities. Pirates, despite their reputation for anarchy and chaos, intuitively understood that without mutual trust, their society could not function. The brutality of their punishments reflected not gratuitous cruelty, but a desperate recognition that betrayal within the group posed an existential threat to all. Today, when we read these stories, it's easy to judge both the thieves and their judges. But before doing so, perhaps we should ask ourselves, if we were in that situation, facing the same dangers, the same pressures, the same temptations, what would we do? Would we have the moral strength to resist greed when no one was watching? Or would we have the courage to confront a treacherous comrade, knowing our decision could mean his death? These are questions that transcend pirate history and touch the core of human nature. And maybe that's why these dark stories of betrayal and punishment fascinate us so much. Not because pirates were so different from us, but because in many fundamental ways, they were exactly the same. In the end, the fate of pirates who stole from their own crews serves as a grim reminder that even in the most marginalized societies, there are lines that must not be crossed. And when those lines are crossed, the consequences can be as final as the deep ocean waters these men called home.